Good evening and welcome. I'm Andy Tomalonis, Managing Editor of the New Bedford Light, and I thank you all for joining us tonight for which will be, I'm thinking will be a very enlightening discussion about New Bedford school finances. We have with us a guest, Andrew O'Leary, who is with the New Bedford Public Schools. He's Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations. And there's been a lot of changes and a lot of new money flowing into New Bedford. So without any delays, I'll let Jack Spillane, our columnist and host of so many of these sessions of the chat, introduce our guest and get rolling with some questions. So take it away, Jack.
Thank you, Andy. Welcome, Andrew.
Hey, Jack. Hey, Andy. Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to give a little bit of biographical information about Andrew, who is Andrew O'Leary is the Assistant Superintendent of Schools for Finance and Operations for the New Bedford Public School District. He's a native of Cork, Ireland, and he holds undergraduate degrees in Government, History, and Political Science from University College Cork and St. Rose's College in Albany. He has done advanced study in education leadership at Northeastern University. After a start teaching in the New Bedford school system, Andrew quickly took over as the Director of State Education and Federal Programs in New Bedford back in 2004. From there, he went on to be the school's district manager, the school district's business manager, and from there to his current position as Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations. Under Andrew O'Leary's leadership, the district has begun an ambitious program of building new schools, rehabbing old ones, and expanding equity programs. Andrew has also shepherded in the government-funded building of a new central kitchen. Those are among his accomplishments. We haven't even mentioned the equity programs yet, so we'll get to them in a minute. So welcome, Andrew.
Good evening, Jack. Thanks for having me.
So how is it you got your expertise in state and federal grant programs? It seems like your background is in government and teaching, and then
yeah, I mean it's been quite a journey, and you know I did look to start out in the district as in a teaching capacity, and I was always interested in college level teaching as well, and history and political science. But there was an opportunity to be the director of what we call federal and state funded programs, and that was heavily grant writing. There was a lot of grants available, state and federally at the time. And of course, with my background in history and political science, I was able to put these packages together and had a successful few years as director of federal and state funded programs. We won a lot of grants. We actually won a Teaching American History grant as well. Although those grants started to go away around the Arne Duncan period when he became Secretary of Education under Obama. You had these Clinton era grants, which were massive investment from US Department of Education. The Bush administration kind of maintained those, but they were dying. And then Arne Duncan era, they went away. So that kind of mirrored my career, became less grants, then I moved more into the finance because I had learned that along the way. But it is a kind of a curious route to end up in charge of financing, starting out perhaps in a history and a teaching role.
Yeah. Well, as a nonprofit publication, the New Bedford Light is well familiar with the grant, the necessity of writing for grants. I imagine you have to be a good writer as well as be able to navigate your way through the dense government language and bureaucracy to be effective.
Yeah. I mean, well, definitely, because you know part of the issue is we joke all the time. Actually, in our grants trainings here, we give grants trainings. And we actually have a running in joke where the first rule of grant training is don't ever apply for a grant. That's your first rule. And then, you know, that because a grant is not what folks might think. It's not a gift. A grant is an obligation. A grant is a contract. A grant is something you're taking on to fulfill the policy wishes of another party. And so when we get grants, we have to be judicious in if you're going to pursue those policy goals. And so that's the first part. And if you understand that the granting agency is looking to fulfill some goals, some of its own goals, and you can articulate how you're going to fulfill that, you've really got to see yourself more as a contractor. And then there's other discussions around that. Well, should you apply for a grant? Because when I first started out, it was all, Well, the more money we can get, the better, certainly, but that's not a smart or strategic way to apply funds.
Why is that?
Well, you do, again, because the funds, just targeting a higher number, a higher revenue figure to bring in. Let's just bring in all these grants. Let's see how much money we can get. Let's continually beat the bushes for funding necessarily is not, you're not thinking strategically. You're not thinking as to how and why you want to apply dollars, what policies and strategies you want to pursue. You're really just trying to win the prize. And it is grant writing, as I recall, is kind of an enjoyable endeavor because you in your single role are committed to getting funds for the district. And when you get the grant, you feel good. We got multi-million-dollar grants. It's a nice feeling. But then actually you haven't achieved anything. You've just lined up work and an obligation for the next 4 years. And then the work just starts. So you have to be ready. Your institution, it's not just about writing and winning the grant. Your institution has to be ready to fulfill that. And you'll see that all throughout the country where, did grants have this impact? Were grants wasted? Was there waste, fraud, and abuse in these grants as well? So there's a whole different way of looking at these things rather than just the dollars.
So is it fair to say that it's almost more important for the district to decide what its goals are, what it wants to accomplish in, I don't know, the next 5-10 years, whatever your planning process is, and then go for grants that might support that? Or
Yeah, that's exactly it. And you can really tell the difference between an organization or leadership that's strategically focused. If they have the confidence that to turn down a grant or to bypass this funding opportunity and say that doesn't suit us at this point, we're going to build a roadmap in another direction.
So I'm learning something here. Did you say that there are a lot of Clinton era grants that are no longer available? Are there any grants available? Do we have a full-time grant writer now?
Yeah, there are. So that's the other thing. I mean, if you look at how we receive funding in the New Bedford schools, we receive it from the different layers of governance. So the city, the state, and the federal government. And it's mainly the majority of our funds come from the state. And the federal government has never really established a strong commitment to education funding. And it's attempted to. So in the Clinton era, it was an era of prosperity. Education funding increased, and so a lot of Title I awards and a lot of additional grants for dropout prevention. A lot of folks will remember Safe Harbors program. It was a huge program in New Bedford from about 2000 2005, where they had it was emphasized on safe and drug-free schools and gang resistance and things like that. And that was a huge program in mental health counseling. But essentially, those programs kind of died away, and you can see somewhere around 2005. So if you go from 1995 to 2005, federal support of education went up. About 2005, it started to die off, and it was really in crisis by up to recently. If you did dollar adjusted or inflation adjusted terms, federal education was federal support of education was very, very low.
So when all that went away, did the state step up to replace it, or is it?
No, that was part of the problem. I mean, and you have some of the core grants you have are Title I and a special education grant called IDA. And you can trace the history of those back to the two eras, the Lyndon Johnson Great Society era. That was Title I. That was Johnson's effort to really try and impact schools that had students in poverty. And of course, Johnson being a former school teacher in poor schools in Texas as well, it was a big deal, a big program. And then when ADA happened, American with Disabilities Act, and IDEA, Education Rights for Students and Disabilities, additional funding came with that in terms of IDEA. So we still get those grants, but they've been underfunded over time and not inflation adjusted. So, and to your question though, what we started to notice around 2012 and onward, right up to the current era where there was some ed reform, was that federal support started to drift away. But I think what happened was the districts that relied on that federal support, like New Bedford, Holyoke, Lowell, they noticed, but other larger cities that weren't so reliant didn't notice. And so it's taken some time to see that funding return in the form of the new federal funds we have.
So I'll put you in the spot just a little bit because I have you here in this story by Colin Hogan, our New Bedford Light reporter about ESL teachers in the New Bedford district. If I understood that story correctly, before maybe 5-6 years ago, there were no ESL teachers in the New Bedford district? Or I forget what the timeline was. Did that have anything to do with grants, or what was the reason for that?
I think I think if you look at New Bedford over the past 20 years, you do see that demographic shift in terms of students and families, and the Hispanic community in the city of New Bedford and Massachusetts generally has grown. But there also was a level where students were somewhat not visible, weren't assessed, and weren't counted. So English as a second language students were here, but they weren't properly assessed and counted. And then in terms of the data systems and systems to generate funding for that support, that didn't happen. So what you started to see around 2013 and 14 and 15 was first accurate counting of those students and accurate acknowledgement that we had English as a second language students. Then you saw some reform at the state, where the state of Massachusetts was asked by the federal government to do a better job. And then we started determining what are those strategies, and that's where you get ESL teachers, what's called an SEI endorsement licensure for those teachers to learn strategies for students learning English. And so all of that has been a good success story. And Dr. Sonia Walmsley gave a presentation to the school committee on Monday night that you folks can watch on cable access, that really shows how this district has done a great job incrementally building up those structures that allow us to see success with that group of students.
That's really good to hear. Without being judgmental, though, when we didn't have any ESL students, was that a shortcoming of the district? Was it a shortcoming of the state?
Yeah, I think both. Certainly, I think it was a shortcoming of education systems that we weren't set up. That the systems weren't set up to acknowledge, to ensure that the appropriate assessments were in place for those students. And then once you know the population of students you have, how you can best deliver services for those students. I think we, as in state of Massachusetts and New Bedford, we're operating on an old model.
Okay. So did you say that the district still has a full-time grants writer?
Yeah, so we still do have grants, but they're very much a technical process where we apply for that Title I, which is for schools in poverty, and IDA, which are special education. So we do still have a grant team. It's very important because the whole other side of this job is compliance. And we need to and there's so many compliance rules and federal regulations and state regulations that really that's what it is. Grants aren't so much anything particularly exciting, although we do get large donations. Over the years, we've gotten donations from Irwin Jacobs, for example. But grants really are a large technical process for districts like ours that rely on those federal and state grant programs for students in high need.
Okay, so in the course of becoming an expert on applying for grants and implementing these programs, you said that you became an expert on the finances of the district also. How did that happen?
Well, so yeah, so what you would see is you would see a lot of grant opportunities coming, and then it was a case of winning those grants or writing those grants, and those grants be awarded to the district. And then it's a matter of, well, was the district ready to implement? So many cases you would have to build an office from scratch. You would get, let's say, $1 million for an after-school program grant, and that was a good thing. It was competitive. It was called 21st Century, and we would get $1 million to run after-school programs. But now the infrastructure isn't necessarily there, so you would want to my office would have to build out and create that infrastructure. So all of a sudden, I was very fortunate. You're able to learn these skills: how to develop contracts with vendors, with other after-school providers, how to learn the law for how this money can be transparently spent. So all of a sudden, you're learning all of this, and to be frank, you're gaining a reputation to say, well, you know money. Perhaps you would be able to manage the local budget as well, and that to kind of develop that reputation that you know how to follow the law, you know how to spend the money, you know how to liaise with the state. So it was I was very fortunate to have that kind of impromptu apprenticeship.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have always thought of the business manager post as a place where you'd have to know how to do accounting. Did you have to teach yourself that?
Yeah, I joke with folks all the time that I'm a history major. I'm not an accountant, and then I joke that, well, I didn't say that in my interview for the business manager position, however. So it's all out in the open now. But I think
the stories I missed in my interviews.
Yeah, right. I think certainly the political science part plays in, though, because, like one of my favorite quotes in political science is politics is the allocation of scarce resources. And once you understand that, you can understand all of your funding if you know essentially the legislative intent. Why does this program exist? That's why I like to refer to, when we talk about our food service program, I talk about Harry Truman. When we talk about Title I, you talk about Lyndon Johnson, and so on. And then that's the starting point. What is the ultimate intent? And then that's how we were able to really look closely at our Chapter 70 funding when we talked about the low income formula. That was all centered around legislative acts. These are political allocations of resources. And then for the accounting, though, you do need to respect that. And you can also look at the origin of that. Why do we have accounting? Well, what does accounting mean? Accounting means, the term accounting means ensuring that it's reported in the right place, in the right ledger. And there's a public part to that. So you are reporting to the public that you are classifying the money appropriately. But that said, for the accounting, we do have a fantastic finance team here that are able to make those reports, manage those accounts, and we do that. We report monthly to the school committee with what we call the UMass system, Uniform Massachusetts Accounting System. So I'm certainly not the expert in that, but fortunately, the experts we have are sitting right to the side of me when we do those reports.
Right. And I imagine that you understand enough of it now that if there's a problem, you could spot a problem by looking at the ledgers and,
Yeah. Well, what we do is, and perhaps it doesn't come across, but we use the school committee as a kind of a forecasting and reporting mechanism. So that's how we discipline ourselves, because you never want to fly blind. If you've seen this district, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago get into trouble, it's because you're not forecasting. So we place a big emphasis on that. We're not just reporting, we're constantly forecasting. And then if you understand the funding formulas, you can actually do a 3 or a 5 year forecast. So you always know that you're in a stable position.
So as you've learned how Massachusetts funds its public school systems, what has it done to your understanding of public education and your philosophy of education? That once you grasp how the system is funded, it must give you some insights into what should be done, what shouldn't be done, what needs to be done to maybe
Yeah,
fund it.
it really does. I mean, it really is fascinating to me once you start to unwind. Let's just say, okay, so for Chapter 70, the state is sending $200+ million to the city of New Bedford. So why is it sending that? How long has it been sending that? So Chapter 70, the provision of the law, came in 1993. So 1993 is the education reform law, where it was all based on a lawsuit. It was based on a lawsuit where students were the plaintiffs, the students in Brockton, and there's a provision in the Constitution written by John Adams, going all the way back. I always have to bring history into it, that students are residents of Massachusetts are entitled to a full, comprehensive education. And the students petitioned on that basis, and it forced the legislature to act. And that happened at the time where there was a lot of push for economic reform in Massachusetts and building out a hub economy and so forth. So it all came together. And so that gets us to, if we want to get specific on that, they said, what is a foundation? What is a foundational education? What does, for example, Brockton or New Bedford need to guarantee a foundation? That's why it's called a foundation formula. So what we're really seeing, it's very exciting. What we're really seeing is all this money flows. This is a true policy effort to say, build, they say to us, here you go, build a foundational education that meets the Constitution, provide that for your residents. And so it's kind of exciting when you see all of that. And then that gets us into, what if that started going wrong? What if that wasn't enough? What if their formula was wrong? And so advocates had said by at least 2015, if not before, this formula is wrong. It's not properly accounting for the cost of an education in a city like New Bedford. And that has, in as much as New Bedford in the past has been criticized for not attaining its educational goals, the finances were certainly a big part of that.
So as a reporter, I've reported both in the city and in the suburbs. And in the city, I would always hear that the funding formulas are not fair, are not accounting for the different demographics in different cities, and also the effect of charter schools on some cities. But in the suburbs, When I was at the Standard Times, certainly, and our suburban reporters would hear this all the time. The suburban districts would complain that the formulas were not fair to the suburbs, and that there was a lot of grousing about that on balance, state tax dollars from the suburbs were going up to Boston and coming back to the cities, and they didn't think that was fair. What would you say to people who think that too many suburban tax dollars are going to the cities? Because after all, New Bedford's public education system, I think at this point is a little less than it used to be. It's 80% funded by the
It's
state.
85 actually. Yeah.
85%. Okay.
Yeah,
So
I think
what would you say
that's
to
the debate.
The suburban residents in Greater New Bedford.
I think that, well, that's the debate, and that's and there has been compromise. So a lot of advocates, I follow very closely. There's a whole subculture of ed finance out there in terms of there's folks at Rutgers University and elsewhere, Brown University, to follow this stuff very closely. And what are ideal models to fund schools? What are the most equitable models to fund schools? What are the most progressive? What states are falling down, and which states are leading the way? And Massachusetts is surprised a lot of people. Massachusetts gets a grade C overall on how progressive it is. So others would say that the taxes or the tax rate or tax revenue are ultimately what goes to education in cities like New Bedford. Massachusetts could and should do more. And part of the issue there was a report that the Mass Business Alliance for Education put out called Missing the Mark. And that made the point that those complaints from the suburbs have led the legislature to make some compromises where everybody gets something. So you have cities and towns in Massachusetts that don't need Chapter 70 that get Chapter 70. That would be the claim in that report. So it seems clear that that there's an argument to be made the other direction as well.
So that's just the politics of it. If you want someplace, and I won't use local towns so no one will get mad at me. So if you want someplace like Wellesley or Weston to buy in to the state funding system, you've got to give them some money back too.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's certainly politics. I mean, the dynamics of the state legislature better than I do, and that's certainly it. It's compromise, and these laws are passed at the climax of the legislative session. Even those who were involved in redoing that formula, the 2019 Student Opportunity Act, would have said they would have had to have compromises. And folks were saying that we're making that very argument that everybody should get something. We need tax relief for our residents and so forth.
We got a soccer player or a rugby player who just walked by. So
that's a New Bedford High. That's my New Bedford High freshman who is a little worn out thanks to the New Bedford High soccer coach is putting him through his paces until 6 o'clock today.
Would that be one of the O'Leary clan?
Yeah. I have two. Well, we have 5 overall, and we have 2 at New Bedford High right now, and they're having a great time in the hallways and on the soccer field. But it's yet to be seen how well they're doing in the classroom.
Yeah. Oh, very good. One of my dogs used to run through some of my shots, so we're used to that. So, Andrew, the pandemic has been a challenge for us all, of course, but it has also opened up some unprecedented funding to address longstanding needs. Talk about the pandemic and what that has meant in terms of funding for the city's school system with it's ESSER funding in the case of the
ESSER funding, the
elementary
and secondary school emergency relief.
Very good.
And that's a piece of ARPA. We know ARPA was the act that was passed to push money out to cities and towns. But one point I made, we were talking about this at the school committee on Monday, and one point I made is we're sitting here right now with a lot of federal money that we need to move by 2026. And however, it wasn't too long ago when COVID first hit in March 2020. By June 2020, the state was really nervous, and there were a lot of revenue projections that the state was going to fall short anywhere up to $4 or $5 billion. $4 and $5 billion is actually the entire education budget in Massachusetts. And so we were told at the time that, no, you got to put in a flat budget at least, and we don't know what's coming. And then that led to kind of this sense of panic, and more federal money came in So, and then by the fall of 2020, the state said, we're good. Maybe it was retail tax, or online shopping tax. They didn't lose as much revenue as they thought. So we had a restored budget in 2020. And by that point, the federal government, I think all that pent up wish that the federal government could get back involved in education, a lot of concern about getting kids back in the classroom, a lot of concern about the quality of buildings, really opened up an unprecedented amount. If you consider that we get $15 million from the federal government every year, and then pretty much in one calendar year, we got 70 million. And we were told you got to spend that in 3 years. It's really a remarkable moment. And I wouldn't say it's too much money. I would say that there needs to be some flexibility on the timelines. And I do think districts do deserve it. The students and the districts that students are in deserve it, given that there has been an unfulfilled promise from the federal government for so long that has led to a lot of the deficiencies we see.
I do think, however, that it's fair to ask for our fiscally conservative listeners, how much of is it 70 odd million?
Yeah, 70 million.
70 million that the district is going to get from the federal government. How much of that will make up for shortfalls of revenue that did not come in during the pandemic, and how much of it is money that but don't get me wrong, I personally am a supporter of that, but I think it's fair for people who are more apprehensive about it, how much of it went to shortfalls and how much of it will go to planning for things that were deferred too long but are not directly related to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think, well, the regulations for the funds, it has to be tied to a pandemic related need. And what we have in Massachusetts, what we see is districts like New Bedford are finally benefiting from the Student Opportunity Act. So we see that our local budget is somewhat balanced. Another thing we mentioned on Monday night at the school committee was, it's all well and good to have this federal money, but you don't want to put your core needs. A lot of folks are saying, well, you got to use that federal money for learning loss, academic strategies. You got to use that federal money for mental health. But you really do you want your mental health program on a 3-year federal award? And do you want your academic programs on that? It's much better to use it for one-time non-recurring, or that are non-recurring for a long time. Use it for that. And then, given that the Student Opportunity Act has increased our local budget, we make sure that we have mental health and academic remediation and other things built into your local budget where they can stay sustainably over time. So, there certainly would be no scenario where that would be wasted. But to your other question that, well, if there are deficiencies, I wouldn't necessarily say those are the fault of districts per se, given that districts from about 2005 to 2015 were in this bind where they were forced into a very strict accountability regimen and ed reform regimen to focus exclusively on academics. And then their facilities were an afterthought.
So was there any shortfall at all? Is there a percentage that of revenue that we didn't have that we needed?
No, there was anticipated shortfalls, but ultimately ultimately Massachusetts actually is sitting in a really good position, as folks know from the debate around tax rebates. And then if you look at that, always a good metric for the state of Massachusetts is the rainy day fund. So the rainy day fund used to be, after the Great Recession, the rainy day fund went down to about under 2 billion. And before the pandemic, it was at just short of 4 billion, I believe. And then they were thinking, oh, we're going to have to tap the rainy day fund. And now the rainy day fund is headed up to about 10 billion under the current proposals.
So we're in good shape. So we just, if I'm correct, the deadline for the first round of spending just took place.
9 days from now, the first round.
So it's 9 days from now for the first round of ESSER spending, federal relief spending. What do we spend? For those viewers who don't, follow the school committee as closely as some people might, what do we spend that money on?
So it breaks down into 3 tranches, essentially. The first was about $5 million, and the second was about $21 million. And then the final amount is about $45 million, although there are some smaller grants then as well. So the first one has to be spent by this week, essentially, and that's the first $5 million. So that $5 million was essentially we did a lot of work on standalone air purification units and cleaning the buildings and making sure that the buildings could meet the standard for return. So making sure we don't have HVAC in every building. So we had those standalone units. There was all that effort was about $1.5 million. Then we used it to, as we were supposed to add some staff, and that was about another $1.5 million. Then about $2 million plus in technology as well, and then some furniture purchases. So it was basically those, in all those cases, non-recurring needs, and where there were staff, which is a recurring. By the time the state revenue picked up, we were able to put those back on the local budget. So that was the first $5 to $6 million.
And some of that sounds like it is directly related to the pandemic. Certainly air filtration systems.
Oh, yeah.
Something that was talked about a lot, the need for that at the beginning of the pandemic. And
yeah, it's funny when you recall, folks were rightly concerned about returning to school, returning to buildings. It was well understood that our buildings had deficiencies. And so if you were a smaller district in Massachusetts that had 3 schools that were built in the 1990s and had full HVAC from basement to the top floor, you didn't have much to worry about. That certainly wasn't the case in New Bedford. So it took a lot of work to raise that level of confidence that we had clean air and airflow and air exchange.
right, getting the buildings ready again certainly is pandemic related. So the second and third rounds coming up. What's the planning for them?
So our big emphasis is on renovation of the buildings that we have, and that's a big part of it. And so we've done assessments of all the buildings, and as part of the COVID plan, and then ultimately
I'll just interrupt here for a second. There's been a problem with deferred maintenance in the New Bedford school system.
Absolutely,
some of its aging buildings for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're certainly not alone in that. If you were to pick New Bedford, Fall River, Lowell, Lawrence, and so forth, Holyoke, even Boston, a lot of the discussion around Boston was centered not around academics. It was centered around some of the facility deficiencies they have there. But New Bedford, yeah, there's definitely a tale that if you go back to 2001, there was a big plan to replace a lot of buildings. That never got off the ground. And ultimately, we ended up with some the 3 middle schools, and we ended up with the Lincoln School. And then ultimately, beyond that, you had plans that were shelved. And so I think there was this general sense that, well, we'll wait until the MSBA can help us replace buildings. And so I think that period, 2008 to about 2013, was a really a period where our buildings were really left to suffer without significant maintenance on the regular budget or without any major capital plan. Now that started to change around 2013, where Mayor Mitchell took office and looked at the buildings again. The city had a great capital planning process in place. You get into things like bond rating and practical plans for applying capital funds with MSBA funds. And all of a sudden we have the Hannigan School. We replaced all the windows in the buildings. But all that work, as great as that was, and as much a success as that was, it still left a lot of needs. Our maintenance budget was still too low, so we weren't maintaining the spaces. And there was still too many buildings out there without a ultimate solution.
I just want to go back again a little bit, because when a district does not replace 100-year-old schools, or when it does not upgrade or renovate 50-year-old schools, that's the reason for that is usually because it's a struggling district economically. It just makes a judgment that we can't afford it. Is that the reason for the
Well, ultimately, the replacing a school building is in any city is ultimately a city obligation, because the city has the capital plan. The city funds the capital plan. So what you need for a successful capital plan is you need a city that has an understanding of its bonding capacity, that has a high quality management team that understands how to go into the bond market and do things from wastewater projects to city buildings to school buildings. Now you've got to be ready for that, and you've got to get appropriate bond ratings and things like that. Then you've got to know what you need on the school end, and you can only get so far. So large cities around the country and large cities in Massachusetts have struggled with that. Their ability to go into the market and not get punitive rates, to get competitive rates. They can only do so much, so many times. So ultimately what I'm saying is cities necessarily can't afford it. And so it's easy then to, there's no option. If you can't afford to replace all of your buildings. For example, a Duval building would cost at this rate about $50–60 million. So we're doing that, but we don't have multiples of $50–60 million to hit the other buildings.
So when you said something that was interesting to me, you credited a better capital planning process for being able to start building again.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. I think, if you were to see, when I read the news and I see some terms about capital and bonds or districts wanting schools around the state, if there is daylight between the city council, which is the authorizer of the purse at the city end, the administration, if there's political instability in an administration, or if there's not a strong CFO, then it's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to line up your financial plan to go into the market. I think the headline recently on the favorable bond rating for the city talked about strong management. So there's almost this qualitative judgment from Standards and Poor's. If you're a trust, ultimately it's a credit check, right? Are you a trustworthy lender? So I think it's very clear the track record for the city of New Bedford from 2013 to 2023. The city deserves a lot of plaudits for that strong management that allowed it to go to the market.
You mentioned the position of CFO, which is of course Chief Financial Officer, and the city was blessed to have a gentleman named Barry Sky he was actually the first CFO in New Bedford. He's now gone to be the town manager in Lakeville, and that position is vacant. And I'll just make a point that the city is having a hard time filling it because the salary may not be high enough.
It's a vital position, and no doubt about that.
Yeah. So we got back onto this planning process, and it wasn't just new schools, it was also replacing windows in a lot of the older schools, which is a favorite of mine. I remember when I first moved to New Bedford 23 years ago, I was astonished because I had never lived any place where the windows in the elementary schools were so opaque. And I just thought, a big part of my day when I was a grade school kid was daydreaming, and you have to be able to look out the windows to be able to daydream. And I think there is a place for daydreaming, to before you get focused back on the math problem that sister is giving you. But I don't know. I think that that maintenance on the air filtration system, the windows, talk about why that was necessary to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think windows are so important, and I do think the city of New Bedford in the 90s did replace a lot of windows in those older pre-war buildings, the red stone buildings. However, what they replaced it with, my guess is that there must have been an emphasis on the fact that they were shatterproof or something like that. And there's always dogging education, is always this public safety mindset that comes before education. And I think that might have been popular in the 90s as well. That, well, at least we're vandalism proof. But again, that the downside of that is that you're not putting your best, literally, you're not putting your best face forward. And so one thing that was very exciting, it's amazing what it does for a building when you do replace the window. And when you do replace the windows, it gives a whole new look to the building. You're actually doing other things as well. The building isn't getting infiltrated by water. You're not getting those leaks. And so that was called the ARP program. And it was a much better deal for the city. So we could replace the essential elements of a building, the boiler, the roof, and the windows. And then the term is you extend the useful life. And now you've extended the useful life of buildings, and you're not going to get what we got at Hannigan, ceiling collapses, and you are going to have allow kids like yourself to daydream a little more, and get some vitamin D as well from the sun.
Definitely needed in my case. So another issue that you've emphasized was New Bedford making progress in operating more equity programs, and programs that will help some kids who come from backgrounds where there are gaps and things that they're missing. Talk about that and how that relates to finances.
Yeah, well, one thing, actually right in the literature, again, and hopefully what I try and share with my team or other folks when we talk about is that school finance is not about accounting. School finance is about what we call, the two big terms in school finance are adequacy and equity. And in the scholarship, they talk about what's adequacy. Adequacy is what we talked about. Is the state of Massachusetts, is the country is your town doing enough? Is it adequate what they're committing to education? And that's where all those debates, which are real interesting, about is Massachusetts meeting its constitutional requirement? Is Massachusetts living up to the 93 law, the 2019 law? Is the amount of money it's setting aside adequate? Now, the other pillar of school finance is equity. And equity is one of the most important things in education in this country. You go back to Brown, the Brown decision, it's all about equity. Equity means, is the money going where it should? Is the money going where it's most needed? And we talk about that when we meet with folks as well. We say, well, the first principle when you're sitting down to budget, is the budget we have adequate? Now, is it equitable? Is it going where it's most needed? And you're never going to answer that fully because it's always a challenge. You're always going to find needs. We talked about how we weren't finding English learner students. They weren't being acknowledged. They weren't being recognized. And so you see that throughout. You've constantly got to have that discussion. Are we being equitable? And then you do have these success stories. We find graduation rate in New Bedford High is a great example, that there's that academic return on investment. The money we're putting in is showing in the data, the MCAS data, the student growth percentile, that these investments are worthwhile. Students are benefiting. There's that return on investment.
So how do you know, I know this is not really your area, but what are the programs that you need to focus on in terms of equity? I imagine that's a district-wide process led by the superintendent and the various assistant superintendents.
Yeah, we have obviously we have a whole Office of School Performance and academic department as well. And there's enormous degree of planning that went into the strategic plan. I would encourage anyone to check out the strategic plan that we have that governs everything we do. It's got 5 goals in terms of community involvement, in terms of high academic standards and rigor, and it's high academic standards for all. So education, for years has been dogged with claims of inequity. Even you see the debate right now in Boston about access to certain schools, the Latin school, exam schools, all these issues. Are we being equitable in access to advanced learning programs? Are we being equitable in terms of special education programming? Are we meeting those needs? Because that's a key pillar of equity is special education. I always tell folks this country doesn't give itself enough credit for its special education programming. The United States has committed to a free, appropriate public education for all students since the 70s. And a lot of other countries, even in the Western world, don't do that. And so it's curious that folks sitting in my seat will always say, oh, my special education costs are so high. My out-of-district costs for a special education placement are so high. But that's the work, that's the equity, that's our ability to provide for all students a free and appropriate public education is an endeavor we really should be proud of. And of course, we can always build better programs. And of course, we're always going to struggle to find staff to fulfill IEPs or meet all needs. But it's the work. It's an enjoyable mission to be part of.
Just to play devil's advocate for a second, though, there has been some criticism that the equity programs can become so expensive that they begin to encroach on the amount of programming you can run for the majority of students who are not so much in need of those programs. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's a debate. I agree. You have to ask what is your core mission here, and that gets into the New York Times actually did this month. It did a collection of articles, collection of opinion pieces, and the lead was, what are schools for? And it is amazing. I think folks don't ask that question enough. What are schools for? And some respondents or opinion pieces in that series said school is for social mobility. Okay, so school is to prepare folks for careers. And if you invest so many dollars in an effective teacher, in 20 years' time, that student is going to be earning X dollars. So there's your calculus. And other folks are pointing out, well, school is for democracy and civic engagement. And we all know we're in something of a crisis of civic engagement. And so that's important. Or school, and one of my favorites was school is for care. School is an oasis where students are provided a safe, healthy, nurturing environment. And that's for everybody. So yes, there is academic advancement tracks there. You have to sustain those. But our ultimate goal is to be that caring oasis where all students can develop and in an authentic way, I think. And if you just refocus your perspective and say, what are schools for? and have a broader conversation there, I do think you'll see it's money well spent.
Where do you see the New Bedford district going over the next 10 years in terms of the way it finances itself, in terms of the programs it wants to run? Uh, we have the charter schools. Where do you see things going over the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think, education, it runs in eras, right? And maybe that's just the historian in me, but, the ed reform era has really run out of steam. I really feel it has. There was this notion, again, with the Arne Duncan era, where you just needed ed reform and silver bullet initiatives, and you could turn around schools and raise levels of achievement, and it's all you needed to do. But I do think the model of education is returning to where I think it should be, is that we can establish and maintain and sustain in perpetuity stable environments for the community, for families, for students. This year, I believe next year is the 200th anniversary of the New Bedford school system. And so it's vital that district should be stable. So we see that as our core goal when we're dealing with the finances, is we're stable. Back when I first started in New Bedford around 2003 and 4, there was and it wasn't just New Bedford, there was a kind of a pink slip culture where every year you had 800, 900 teachers, you'd lay off 100, and then the next year you'd hire some of them back when the federal money came in. And it's just horribly unstable. How can you build anything if you don't have a stable foundation? So my hopes for New Bedford over the next 10 years would be stability, reliability, that you're an institution that the city is proud of, and the state is proud of, and that there's a competent, stable management that's providing, as we said, everything that kids need.
Right. And for the foreseeable future, the funding system that we have, this combination of state, federal, and local funding, do you see that staying about where it is now, or?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the Student Opportunity Act, it was explicit. It said we will give this amount of funding on increments. So why it's really important to understand the legislation, understand the formula, is then you can forecast. So what we do around this time of year is we say, well, what is our enrollment? Okay, what are our demographics? How does that fit with what we know the state will fund next year and the year after? Because you never want to hire too many staff that you can't sustain. You've got to build a model that's sustainable over multiple years. And I do think that education has suffered from that 1 year cycle. Will we lay off? I mean, we still go into meetings where budget meetings or budget presentations where folks think that, oh, you have to cut. There's a cut. And it's not necessarily about cutting. I mean, it's important that folks know they're getting value for money. So you kind of show that you're a good steward of public funds. But if you're constantly talking about, well, where can the cuts be made, or you're really not building a strong institution.
Has your educational philosophy changed these last almost 20 years that you've been in the New Bedford system, and seen how things work, learned how things are financed, learned about the equity issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, education is K-12 field is so full of theorizing and ideas. It's exhausting at times. And so, I've been in various ed grad programs where there's been theories du jour, such as learning styles and various silver bullets, and the whole theory about digital natives, that computers were going to make everything irrelevant. And now we see that schools actually have to be an oasis from flickering screens, not just the focus for screens. And so there's education. I do think that period from 2000 to 2015 was a period full of educational gimmicks, that all of our educational problems were going to be solved with aggressive reform, with technology, rather than seeing what was in our backyard the whole time, what's been in our backyard for 200 years, of public education in America as a great leveler, as a place where there's an equity philosophy, and where it's a great use of public dollars.
So you talk about the reform movement sort of dwindling down. What has replaced it? Sometimes you hear people kind of glibly talk about back to basics and things like that. I know myself, I was always worried when during one of the recessions, things like art education and music education began to disappear from the systems. I think they did cut it out while I had been in New Bedford for a short time.
Yeah.
Where what will replace? Is it back to basics? What replaces education?
Well, I think, I mean, it depends, and that, because that gets into a question of definition. What do you mean by ed reform? You know, there's nothing wrong with reform as a term or as an idea, but what I'm talking about is the movement that stated that it was out to disrupt. We have to disrupt public education, and what I would say is we need to stabilize public education. Schools need to be stable, and I don't think disruption has worked. And I think, you know, if you look at part of that is charter schools were reformed, but as much of an issue in Massachusetts, the charter schools have been, the charter schools in Massachusetts are markedly different than the charter schools around the country and the various charter and voucher movements. And I think it's not necessarily my place to praise the charter schools in New Bedford, but there's a reason Alma Del Mar and Global Learning Charter School have been around and because they've emerged as stable forces.
Just briefly explain how Massachusetts charter schools are different.
They're far more regulated. It's harder to open a charter school in Massachusetts. There's a lot more oversight. I don't think it's ideal oversight personally. I do think there have been a lot of errors, but the ability to open a charter school in other states is a lot easier. The ability to draw down core district funds is a lot easier, and there are less stabilizers there as well. There's a lot of voucher programs where this idea that you can take an average cost in a district and liquidate that and give it to parents and then fund unaccountable programs as well. That's, in some cases, there's something of a Wild West in other states as part of school choice. That's not the case in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has moved slowly and deliberately in expanding charter schools. It has caused disruption for districts, which was ill-advised, but I do think it's worth pointing out that it's not the same as, let's say, a Florida or an Arizona.
So as a numbers guy, you do buy into the argument that that the way the system is set up in Massachusetts, and I know the state has not always reimbursed the districts, particularly in the second and third years, out the level they pledged to reimburse them, that the charter schools, as they currently are set up, do drain funding from the
yeah, absolutely. I think, personally, I think if you were to look at the constitutional arguments in 1993 in ed reform and how schools are supposed to be funded, I personally think there's a constitutional question to ask that liquidating, if you've established that cities and towns constitutionally are entitled to this level of funding to provide services for students, parceling that out on an individual basis, knowing that it's going to compromise the core district because it's obvious, and that flies in the face of what was supposed to be put in place in '93. So it does, so it does have an impact. But I do think it gets obscured because it's just too easy an idea, this per pupil idea, that you can take all the money in a district. In New Bedford is $200 million, let's say, and you can divide that by 13 to 14,000 students, and you can say, well, everybody should operate with that. But that's no way to stabilize anything. You can't do that for any organization, any institution, any entity can't operate that way. But even though it makes logical sense when you say to folks per pupil, I joke all the time that the single worst idea is this idea of per pupil, because it's an automatic admission that funding can be broken up, and it really can't.
And there's also the issue of when students leave for a charter district, they don't leave from one school, they leave across the district. So it's hard to calculate where you can save money.
Yeah, it does. So again, it's unfortunate because, what happens is what happened in New Bedford, that the battles, the debates, the fractures all take place in a community, and the emotions run high. And so there's this battle in a community where the community is ultimately the victim of poor and short-sighted state policy.
Well, the fact is, the charters in New Bedford do remain popular, the ones we have, and there is a waiting list, I'm told, for both schools. So I'll just leave it at there is something that people are.
Yeah, I would say, but I would only note too that there's a marked difference between a stable, ground-up charter school that sustains over time and outwardly imposed charter schools that are riding the wave of ed reform from the state.
Yes, and as we know, we had a very bad experience in New Bedford with the City on a Hill
Exactly.
experience. Andrew, I've noticed in recent months that you have a very active Twitter account, and I can't help be a little bit envious of it. You kind of have this very easygoing manner in which you weigh in on various educational topics, especially on social media. How did that develop?
Yeah, yeah, I like going on Twitter because all the ed finance geeks are on there. So there really is a very active community, and it really is professionally. I do find it very useful you do identify trends, you do identify tools and templates and other things like that. And again, it's just the political science student in me that will never go away. I am interested in issues of equity and how policy translates or fails to translate into, and how it leads to how policy leads to adverse outcomes and those kinds of things. And it's all out there. It's fascinating, the whole policy field, and Twitter is just great for policy discussions.
Yeah, fair to say you tend to be progressive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Maybe that's the social democratic European in me, I guess. I don't know.
Nothing wrong with that. Are there any topics that we haven't? We're rounding up. We have about 3 minutes left. Any topics that you would have liked to have talked about tonight that I didn't bring up? Because an hour goes by quickly.
No, I definitely appreciate the conversation, and I really appreciate the New Bedford Light, because I do think that, well, you remember back in the day, the school department made the front page quite a lot. And while those of us sitting on County Street didn't always necessarily like it, when you look back on that, you at least recognize that it was a vibrant community environment, and that can only lead to the school's been held to account. So by that token, I think folks should pay attention to the schools and pay attention to the funding, and we're more likely to be able to make a better argument that New Bedford gets its fair share if everyone's involved.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. The media is a funny entity. You can't live up with us. You can't live without us.
Right.
I do think that I remember a time when virtually everything that moved education-wise was covered in New Bedford. We covered vast swaths of the paper to all the MCAS results, and similarly on health issues, city government, the same thing. And the business model for all of that has changed. But since we have another couple of minutes, I'll just ask you, since I have you, what can we in the media do better? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong?
No, I think
educational coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the media landscape's interesting, right? I mean, the New Bedford Light's got a very core mission. And I do think, I would just say that, one of the best things I've ever read in 20 years in New Bedford is Will Sennett's article on the fishing. I mean, from someone who likes to, again, as we said about Twitter, understanding how policy impacts, how deep money flows. And we all talk about dollar signs and per pupil funding, but actually how the real deep money flows. I mean, that's just a fantastic example of good, solid journalism. And I would hope that that we see more of that from the New Bedford Light. That's the kind of stuff I like to read. It's kind of the way I like to approach my job, that it's not just about the account, it's actually about the deep money over time and how it flows. So more of that, and you'll at least have one fan.
It was a great achievement by Will, and we plan to do more of that, and follow the money. It's always a good place to start an investigative story. I see Andy is back, so Andy, why don't you close it out for us?
All right. Well, I thank everybody who joined us, and especially you, Andrew. It was a terrific discussion. There have been a lot of changes in the school funding this year, and you've highlighted it, and to the benefit of everybody who's watching tonight. And Jack, as usual, it's a great job. You always seem to find the right questions to ask and the right timing for everything. So join us for the next one. It's not announced yet, but we'll soon be trying to set up debates and other issues that to come forward on the chat. And so join us, and thank you for joining us tonight. This recording will be available, although not tonight. We should set it up for tomorrow. So thank you all, and thank you, Jack, and thank you, Andrew. And that's it. We'll look forward to the next time we all get together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for joining the chat, Andrew.
Thank you.